I'd like to topics and introduce you to the first two topics. We'll be covering basically each of these topics in a week in this course. So first we'll go to the motivation, why we do this in the first place, and then some data models, how we structure our data. We're going to talk about map projections and coordinate systems, how we get the curved Earth's surface into the flat environment that we use, and how to go back and forth and use that quickly and easily, because that's the root of a lot of misunderstanding. Then 3 weeks, 4 weeks on how we get data into our GIS system. We often, unless we're lucky to work in a field where we can buy our data, we often spend more time entering the data, or at least as much as we do at analyzing it. And then we have 7 weeks on the analysis portion. So tables and how we structure our tabular data, our attribute data about the features we're interested in, basic spatial analyses, how we work with grid or raster continuous variable spatial analysis, spatial models and modeling, interpolation, how we fill in the blanks between where we have samples, data quality, how we know what we're doing really cuts the mustard, it reaches our level of accuracy, and then some introduction to things that will be coming down the pike. This is a quickly changing field even after 30 years of development, and that affects how we interact with the technology and the kinds of analyses we can do. So for this week, we're interested in working with basically chapters 1 and 2. And the first chapter is really a motivation, a description of the landscape, and then the second chapter talks about data models. So the second chapter in the required readings in the textbook. The long and the short of it is why GIS is because there are a lot of us and we're stepping on each other's toes in both how we use resources and then how we manage the waste products, the results, the consequences of our use of resources. There's just a lot of us trying to use the same things at the same time. So there are these impacts, and quite commonly we're trying to mitigate those impacts or trying to reduce those impacts in the first place by using GIS. Lots of concrete examples. One that I have here at the start of the course is lobster fishing. So there are all sorts of issues with lobster fishing, but it's basically a geographically constrained activity. You have to be able to reach the lobster pot, so you can't do it in too deep a water, and that's actually where the lobsters are found. And you have to know where the lobsters are and make sure you get enough of them in the location. Lobster is one of the few fisheries that is not overfished because of a system of assigned areas. And there are basically licenses for areas, but even before that, there were established protocols for making sure only a certain number of people fished in a certain area. You had your territory, and if you went setting up your pots in somebody else's territory, first they'd steal or break your pots, and then steal or break your boat, and then break your head, I guess, if you persisted, but it rarely got that far. Lobsters go out and breed in deeper waters, and then the young float for a bit and then land and migrate to shallower waters. The adults migrate there, and people catch them in these lobster traps and pots. They're interested in a sustainable fishery, and there are lots of issues besides overfishing that are threatening lobsters, climate change, pollution, a bunch of things. And so it's inherently a spatial kind of problem, and it can be addressed with spatial analysis. So there's been a lot of work in trying to measure and model the things that affect lobster survival, growth, good production, and the harvesting in areas. So the distribution of lobster larvae, how do you get good recruitment from one year to the next, temperature, other things that will affect them, water quality, water clarity, combined with sampling, so you have models of where pollution might affect them, where temperature might affect them, sample populations to try and manage the catch so you don't overfish the lobsters where they are. It's inherently spatial, and so GIS is key in all its phases, from sort of data collection through organization, through analysis, through the production output. So What's in it for me? We want you to think about what you want to get out of the course and where you think you'll be using spatial analysis. Now, in the in-person class, we have people do this 5-minute free write. We'll also put on the Canvas page a place for you to do a 5-minute free write to locate what you want to get, to identify what you want to get out of this class and what are your basic interests. So there's lots of GIS tools out there. Now we'll primarily use the Esri ArcGIS, as we said earlier in a previous video. This is half or more of the market, and there's a lot of jobs where you see the requirement to use ArcGIS. It's probably not the best learning tool. It's quite complex, but all of them are to an extent. It's also quite expensive, so there are a lot of small shops that don't have the latest version or just don't have it, period, or nonprofits or other things. So there's lots of others out there that are as good for various things. ArcGIS isn't good in the market and big in the market because it kind of has a little bit of everything. A lot of analysis now is going on in R and Python, a lot of spatial analysis. But even then, it's hard to get away with Arc, both for the input and for the output. They have an Arc editor, an Arc set of devices and softwares for inputting data in the field and integrating that quickly into an existing geodatabase. Some of these others have that also. But it's limited in some of the analysis. Well, almost everything is compared to R, especially because there's so many people working in the spatial analysis in R these days. But R is pretty slow for large data sets, and also R is even more user hostile than Esri, so it's really, unless you're going to be heavy into analysis, you probably don't want to learn this, or there's something specific that it does. Python allows you to code, and actually Arc interacts with both of these to allow you to code specifically for things that aren't in the toolbox in Arc. There are others. QGIS, for example, is a very capable open source, i.e. free software package. Then there are various others used in various particular environments or various particular industries. So microimages or AutoCAD and design, Intergraph, and a lot of the utilities management, MapInfo and business. Erdas for a lot of image processing, Manifold for some business and marketing, Grass is another open source. So there's lots of tools out there. Same concepts though, so you should be able to apply those concepts learned in this class and used in Esri ArcGIS to any of these if you have a good conceptual understanding. Now, a couple of caveats. You have to have the scientific or the model of how a system works identified and make sure that it makes sense, that it has support before you replicate that or apply that analysis on a spatial basis in any GIS. So ARC gives you tools for data analysis and tools for data management, but if you don't have an underlying relationship, you can make a mistake more efficiently with any GIS, as well as you can get a correct answer more efficiently. So you have to be careful and make sure you're not applying fanciful relationships to get a output or a map that gives you fanciful or nonsensical results. Here's an example here where we have sort of the proportion of mainstream buffer deforested on streams. So if you have a main stem of a stream, you know how much of it is deforested. People have gone out and measured the nitrate loading, which is bad in the stream, the water, and established a relationship there. So if I go and map the proportion of the main stem buffer that doesn't have trees for this area where these data were developed, then I can predict the water quality in streams where I haven't measured the water quality. So I get to estimate this important variable, but only because someone has gone to the work of establishing this relationship. You can do what-ifs or fanciful relationships, but they're only as good as the scientific analysis, the scientific data supporting them. And don't go making things up just because they make sense in your brain, because you often don't have these relationships. You need to be able to defend the particular spatial model you apply that's based on some measurement space model. Now, there's lots of steps for successful analysis. Of course, the first one is that you have that relationship. that you're trying to model here in the software. You also need to define the bounds of your geographic region of interests and choose a data model. We'll talk about data models. And then define a grain size, which is the size at which you will apply the analysis, the geographic unit, the area in square feet or meters, or the mapping that you're going to use. Will you do it on a individual plot, on a lot size for a cadastre that people own, on a raster, and I'll talk about what a raster is, but on a checkerboard little grid cell size? What's your grain size? And you have to match that to the data that you've collected. You have to identify existing spatial data then and make sure that it fits your needs. Determine the coordinate system. Again, we'll talk about that next week. Develop your database, document it, perform the analysis, take a look at it, maybe adjust some of the way you apply things, do that repeatedly until finally you have results that you're confident represent something close to the truth, and report those as results. You often then update the database. So it's this iterative process, and the model that you apply underlies all of this. It drives a lot of these decisions. So the representation you have of the world is driven by the relationship that you're trying to replicate. So in this case, it's this mainstream buffer deforested versus nitrate. I want to get a nitrate in the streams across the landscape. That's what my model is trying to predict. Well, I need to map this, and I need to map this in a way that's suitable for predicting this. So at a small enough spatial grain, I need to go get those data. I need to combine those data with where the streams are. So you can see that the model here generates really a lot of the constraints on your analysis. I talked about the extent and the grain size, so I'll talk a little bit more about this now. The extent is the spatial scope of my analysis. How big an area am I going to do this? And the grain size is the smallest thing I want to be able to resolve. So I have to measure or be able to interpolate down to that level for the smallest thing you want to be able to resolve. Now, sometimes it's uniform. So in a raster, we have a uniform set of grid cells. Sometimes it's an object, a blob, and we have to figure out what's the smallest blob. My data must be measured at that level. So we have to answer those two key questions. The problem is, life's often about managing your expectations, so people want the biggest extent possible and the smallest spatial grain possible. But life's full of trade-offs, you know that. So when you have a very fine resolution for a given area, the data volumes really increase, right? You go from coarse resolution, so large objects, hundreds of yards on the side, to a few inches on the side, or hundreds of meters on the side, to a few centimeters on the side. Your data volume goes up with the square of your resolution, right? Because you have the resolution in both directions. As the area increase, your data volumes increase, again, with the square of the area. So if you both fine resolution and large areas, you often overload your system. You have to meet someplace in the middle. The other thing that's important is that the cost of this fine resolution increases, right? As the extent increases, the error accumulated across your distances is probably likely to increase, and the data cost for a fixed level of accuracy increases as you get finer grain. So the third key question is, what grain size can I afford while meeting my accuracy targets? The smaller the grain size, the harder it is to get good data. So errors increase with the extent and the decrease in the grain size. So you're balancing all these things. Often you can't afford the largest extent at the finest grain. You have to decide what grain you can get away with, what grain is going to work for you. Right? Another thing you have to be clear on is that resolution is not accuracy. Especially in this days of drones, you can collect data at a very fine resolution, right? Inch level data. I can guarantee you there are very few drones these days that have even foot level accuracy because of the way the data are processed. So you have this mismatch between the resolution and the accuracy, and you're fooling yourself if you think they're the same. So the accuracy is how close something is to the truth, right? The resolution is the grain size. So here I have these little picture elements, these little pixels. You can see these little gray squares. That's the size of the resolution, much smaller than the accuracy in this case, right? This arrow painted on the ground should be right here, and it's not. So the resolution, especially with drone data, is much greater than the accuracy. You want to match the two because in most cases, unless you have a drone, there's just a lot of data that you're processing for no apparent extra value, right? You want to increase the resolution. So coarsen the resolution to match your accuracy, or increase the accuracy to match your resolution, right?